Let's take a look at SQL Server Management Studio's Object Explorer. Now you use the Object Explorer to explore the object model of the various services that SQL Server provides. And you can access the Object Explorer either by pressing F8 on your keyboard or using View Object Explorer. And if you haven't used it before, you'll get this big blank dialog popping up. And what you have to do is connect to the services you want to explore. And you can explore more than one if you wish to. And there's a couple of ways to make the connection. One is to click on this Connect Object Explorer dialog, and you'll get a SQL login dialog like this. And you can choose from the server type dropdown the service that you want to explore. And you'll be logging in with this identity. Now you can't pick the identity that you want to log in under. It'll be whatever identity you use to start up SQL Server Management Studio. And if your server supports SQL Server authentication, you can pick that from here and then put in a name and password. So we're going to end up exploring the database engine, but there's another way to go and get connected to the service you're interested in, and that's this Connect drop-down. And for example, if we want to connect to the database engine, we'll get the same dialog again, but the server type drop-down is disabled. It'll be locked to whatever you picked when you hit that drop-down. So let's go and make our connection. And once we do that, we'll get this typical Explorer view. And it'll have all these folders or folder-like items that roll up, sometimes other folders and sometimes actual objects. Now, the way that the Object Explorer is implemented, or at least the way that the SQL Server Management Studio gets the data to build this Explorer, is by using a .NET library called SQL Server Management Objects, or SMO. And you can use that library in your applications too. So if you make an end user application where sometimes the end user has to do some database management stuff as opposed to the typical sorts of querying sorts of things you do with ADO.NET. For example, some end user applications have to be able to allow an administrative personnel to add a login or add a user to a database, something like that. You can do that with raw T-SQL and ADO.NET, but you'll probably find it quite a bit easier to do using SMO. And that's another talk, but I just wanted to point out that you can use the same code that Microsoft uses in its Object Explorer in your applications if you want to go do that. Now all of these rolled up things, all of these folder-like icons have properties associated with them, and you can access those properties through their context menu, which you can get at through a right mouse click and going down to Properties. And for example, these are the properties of the server. The very top of the tree is the service, I should say, the server that the service is running on. And you can get things like, what's the version of this server? Am I running on the 32-bit or the 64-bit version? I can go and see how much memory is in here. I can actually go change how much memory it uses. Now that won't change till you restart SQL Server. I can control the processors that it uses and those kind of things. I can take a look at these database settings. And what these are used for is when you create a new database on this particular server, these are the settings that that database will have. So you can control a lot of the things from here. And likewise, if I drill into databases here, we'll see all the user databases on this server, and the system databases are rolled up at a lower level to get them out of the way of your user databases. And if I go and open up that folder, I'll see the four databases you always see on an instance of SQL Server. And just like I could on the server, if I want, I can go and get the context menu and get the properties for a database, in this case for this CTE ranking partitioning database, which is a database from one of the modules in the SQL course. And again, control how this thing actually works. Look at all the options for this database. Many of the options can be changed. For example, this database has a recovery model of simple, and when you're making a database for development purposes and stuff like that, that's a good choice because you don't have to worry about running out of log space. A typical production database would probably be recovery model full because you'd want to actually be able to recover from big failures and go back to where you were. But for development type databases, typically you go and use simple. But that's how it allows you to get access to that. And again, if I drill into a database, no big surprise, you'll see roll-ups of all the tables, the views, some other stuff we'll look at in just a second. And if I go down here into the tables, I can see all these tables. Now there's a couple of things I can do with the tables that I can see here, and these are, again, things that are handy when you're developing or debugging. If I go to the context menu for example, the employees table. And let me do something here to move that up a little bit higher so you can see the whole thing. I'm going to bring up the context menu again here. These are all the things you can do with an individual database. For example, if I wanted to, I can read 1,000 rows so I can get like a quick look at what's in the table. I can actually edit them. I can script the table out. We'll see that in just a second. And I can look at all the properties of the table. And for example, these are the permissions associated with this table. Nothing special here. Storage type stuff about it. You know, it's not using compression or anything like that. Some of those features we have in SQL Server. Let's go and just take a quick glance at what's in this table, which I can do with select top 1,000 rows, and these are the top 1,000 rows. So again, if you're developing or debugging, that's handy. And this is nice. It gives you the select statement that was used to go and do that. Let's get rid of this. We don't need it anymore. The other thing you can do, which is also really handy, is you can edit the top 100 rows. Again, when you're debugging, sometimes it's handy to be able to go in. I'm going to change this guy. I'm going to put him on first shift like this. And just like in a lot of other UIs that work with tables in SQL Server, when I change the focus of the row I'm on, it'll actually write that out. And now Sherman Oliver has been changed to the first shift. And if I come back here and do my quick scan of the first 1,000 rows, we'll see, in fact, yeah, it's stuck. No big surprise there. So I can go and change the tables and do things like that. Another thing I can do with the objects that are in this database is I can go to their context menu and I can ask the Object Explorer to give me the script that would add this object to the database. So I can say script table as a create. In other words, give me the script that will add this table to the database, and I can output it to a file, a clipboard. I can make a SQL agent job out of it. In this case, I'm going to put it in a new query window so you can see what it does. And it'll generate all of the T-SQL script necessary to build the table, put the indexes in it, all of that kind of interesting stuff. So that can turn out to be pretty handy. And as an interesting point, the way that the Object Explorer is generating this script, it isn't actually generating itself. SQL Server Management Studio has the smarts to generate the script for any object you explore with it. So again, if you use that library in your applications, if you occasionally have to script out the definitions of things, you can do it in your application too. So let's go and get rid of this. And if I go back up to the Tables folder and go to its context menu, no big surprise, one of the things I can do is add a new table. And I'll get a UI, which again is very similar to a lot of UIs for adding tables. So I can come in here and add a column like this, and I can pick the data type for the column. I'll leave it as a regular char type. If you don't like nulls in your database, you can turn off and allow nulls, or you can leave it on, whatever you want. Let me go and add another column here. Each one of these columns, has to have a different name. Each one of these columns has properties, and I'd like to make column 2 an identity column. So to do that, I want to make it an int. And then if I come down here, let me roll this up a little bit so it's a bit easier to see. These are the properties of the column I currently have selected. And one of the properties in here is the identity specification. Notice this is not an identity column. I can change it to an identity column. I can say, yes, I want it to be an identity column. Oh, and by the way, I would like you to increment that column by 2 instead of 1. So I can do all the normal things, again, to go and create and design this table from the Object Explorer. Once I'm done designing it, I can go and click on this floppy disk icon, and it will save it into the database, and I get to go and name it. So I can call it my table like this and go and save it. And then if I want, I can go on and do another table and another table and another table and keep going doing that. But I'm done doing tables right now. And if we take a look here, we'll see here's my table, and if I drill into it, I can see all the columns. Those are the columns I added to the table. If I go back over to this employees table, I can again see all the columns and their data types. If I want to know if it has an index, I can find out the indexes are listed right there. So in terms of all of the objects are very similar. They have different kinds of properties. You can create these objects when you need them. You can explore the values in these objects if they're tables and things like that. And you can actually go and remove things. We can actually go back down to my table right here. And if I go to its context menu, once again, let me move this up so it's a little bit easier for you to see. If I go down here and bring up the context menu for my table, one of the things I can do is delete it or rename it. Now, if you come from the C#, VB.NET world, it makes sense to delete a table. If you're in the T-SQL world all the time, this is the same as drop, but it's called delete in this UI. So if I say I want to delete the table, it doesn't delete it. It gives you a chance to look at what you say you want to delete. And lots of times within a database, you have dependencies on a table, and you can go to this dependencies dialog and it will tell you these are the objects that depend on my table. Well, nothing depends on this yet. And likewise, I can go and see the object that my table depends on. So you can check that stuff out before you choose to actually go and just blow it away, which you can do by doing that. So you can add tables, delete tables, inspect tables, get a quick look at the data that's in those tables. Couple of other things that are really kind of interesting, just because they're interesting objects. If I go in the programmability folder, you'll see the program type things that are in a SQL Server, like all the stored functions in it. And I'm not going to open up this particular one because these are all the system stored procedures, and there's a whole bunch of those, and we'll be waiting for it to dig them all out. I can go and look at all the functions, and these are broken up by the kinds of functions there are. This particular database has a function here called get employee page, and if I open this up, I can see the parameters for the function and that sort of thing. In fact, I want to go to another database because the programmability stuff is a little bit more interesting in it. This is the CLR1 database, and again, this is part of the SQL Server course, and this is the database that's used for examples about how to go and add .NET functionality to a database. And if we again look in this programmability stuff, and I'd like to move it up so you can see the context manuals, you notice there's a folder of assemblies. These are the assemblies that are in this particular database, and there's a whole bunch because it's a demo database for showing how to add a .NET functionality to it. And I can go and say, gee, I'd like you to script out this assembly. Well, this is a pile of code. How's it going to script out an assembly? Let me go and create to new query editor window. And you'll see this is the SQL to go and do this. This is create assembly, name for it, authorization. And then there's this long binary number. I'm not going to go out to the end of it. These are the bytes from the file that implements this Fibonacci assembly. This is the actual bytes, and this is the permission. It's a safe assembly. It only does calculations. But what's really interesting, if you go down a little bit further, this particular assembly was added using Visual Studio, and when Visual Studio adds an assembly to SQL Server, it adds some other stuff. Notice it says alter assembly, add file from, and again, this is the binary, this is the bytes from that file, and notice what it is. It's the debug file for the Fibonacci assembly. And here's another one. This is one of the source code files for it, and this is another source code file for it. This is the one where most of the .NET properties are and stuff like that. So when you have assemblies that have been loaded by Visual Studio, you can actually go and grab the source code if you want to from them, because this is some of the information that's in here. And there's another interesting thing we can look at. Let me close this one. Let me go back to the CTE ranking and partitioning database, which is one which isn't used to demonstrate .NET capabilities, and go into assemblies. Notice there's an assembly here. It was actually over in the other data, in the CLR1 database too. It was hidden by all the other stuff. There's a number of data types in SQL Server that are implemented using .NET, and this is the assembly that goes in and implements those particular pieces of functionality in SQL Server. Okay, well, those are some of the things we can do. We can also do some other management things which are actually kind of useful sometimes, especially when you're doing debug or maintenance. You can go and take a look at the SQL Server logs from here. It's just a handy way to get at them. If I double click this guy, what I'll get is this UI for the logs. And again, this is all the stuff that SQL Server logged whenever you said to log something. A whole bunch of things happen when it starts up, and I can look at a couple of different logs at once or put them back. So again, when you're debugging, sometimes you can't understand why something happened, but you can take a look and see that Service Broker Manager has shut down, for example. This was probably part of shutting down SQL Server. So that's a handy thing you can get to through the Object Explorer here. Okay. Well, this is pretty interesting. Notice I was able to go and take Management Studio, open up the Object Explorer, and pretty much party on everything in the database. And that might be a little bit worrisome. What happens if an ordinary user uses Management Studio and decides to go into the Object Explorer? What can they do? Well, they can't do anything they wouldn't normally be able to do with their user rights. So an ordinary user would not be able to go in and party on the whole database. They can only party on the things that they have rights to. And let's take a look at an example of that. So what we're going to do here is look at another management function we can do from the Object Explorer. We're going to add a login to this service. And I have an identity on my machine that I use when I need to go and see what happens when ordinary users use software. That user is called Minidan on this machine, and it's an ordinary user. Minidan is a member of users, but not a member of things like administrators or debuggers or anything like that. Minidan is just an ordinary user. So what we would like to do is add Minidan as a login to this server, so that then we can see what happens when Minidan tries to go and start up the Object Explorer in Management Studio. So if we take a look down here, in fact, let me just show you where this is. Underneath the server is a folder called Security, and these are all the security items that are associated with the server, not with individual databases. And I want to open up some of these things down here just to be able to go and push this up a little bit further so you can see the context menus. So here you can see these are the logins on this server, and these are all the various logins that we have in here. This is the login I was just using. And of course, because this works like all the other folders in the Object Explorer, I can get a context menu on this and say, I want to add a new login. And what do I want to add? Well, I can go and decide to add a login with SQL authentication or Windows authentication. Normally, SQL authentication is turned off. It's not recommended that you use it. I'm going to use Windows authentication. So I want to search for a user I can use. And this dialog, if you've brought up any of the administrator tools in Windows, this is the same dialog you often see to go and pick things in Windows. And I want to use the Advanced tab because I just want to look at all the users on this machine. And if I scroll way down here, here's Minidan. Minidan is this user that has virtually no property. So let me go and pick Minidan, come over here, and now I've added a login named called Minidan. Now there's a couple of other things I can specify when I add a login. One of the key ones is the default database. And here you can see the default database is master, and that looks pretty scary because it looks like when Minidan logs in, he'll be able to go and party on master. Well, that's not the case. This is really sort of a convenience thing. It's an important convenience thing. What the default database says for a login is when Minidan logs in, if he doesn't specify what database to use, he's using master. But of course he has no rights in master, so that would never even work. So let me go and make his default database one that he would normally be using. And again, typically for ordinary end users, there's one particular database they're using all the time, and you make that their default database. So in this case, Minidan's default database is CTE ranking partitioning. Again, another one of the demo databases from the SQL course. So let me go and create this login. And now we can see we've got Minidan's login here, and I can do a right mouse button properties and get back all that stuff I just did. Now there's a little gotcha here. Minidan has a login, so that means SQL Server can authenticate who Minidan is from his Windows credentials. That's a good thing. However, Minidan has absolutely no rights in CTE ranking and partitioning at this point because he's not a user in that database. We haven't added him yet. We're going to do that in just a second. And whenever a user tries to log into SQL Server, if they have no rights in their default database, their login will fail. Kind of makes sense. It doesn't make sense to log him in otherwise. So let's go and add Minidan as a user to the CTE and ranking database. So in order to add Minidan as a user in the CTE ranking and partitioning database, I go up to that folder in the Object Explorer, and if you notice down here is a security folder, just like there is a security folder for the server itself. However, in this case, it doesn't have logins, it has users, and these are the current users in this database. And just like all of the other context menus, the user context menu, if I do a right click on it, allows me to add a new user. And to add a new user, I go over here. If I knew the name and everything, I could just type it in. But let me go over here and use this browser. And this is really the same UI you get when you're using the admin tools in Windows to see the users on a machine. Here's Minidan. So I want to add Minidan as a user. Now there's something else I can do when I add a user to the database, to a particular database. You can notice Minidan's name is really machine or domain / Minidan. And I really don't want to have to refer to him as Dark Matter 5 Minidan every time I want to do something with him in the CTE ranking and partitioning database. So I want to give him a shorter name. In fact, I'm going to give him the name Minidan. So now inside the database, I can refer to the login Dark Matter 5 Minidan as Minidan. And another thing I want to do, and this is a way you typically or quite often set up users of databases. If it's an ordinary user, lots of times you want to let them read anything in the database. And of course, when you do this, you have to be careful about what information you're going to put in that database. But in a lot of cases, you want to allow them to read the stuff in the database, but not change anything. So I'm going to add Minidan as a user to the database. And when he goes and logs in, he will be a DB data reader in this database. He'll be running in that particular role. I'm sorry, I just clicked the schema. I didn't want to do the schema. I wanted to come down here and make him a member of the DB data reader role. So now he has read rights on everything in the database. One of the ways you often add new users. So now we can say OK, and you can see that Minidan has appeared here. And again, if I go to the context menu properties, you'll see the stuff we just said. Okay, now we're all ready to set up so that Minidan can go and try and use the object browser. And to do that, Minidan has to go and start up SQL Server Management Studio. Now, by default with SQL Server Management Studio, you can't just click on it and say who you want to start up as. You're always going to be starting up as the user you're currently logged in. So we have to pull a little trick on SQL Server on SQL Server Management Studio. We have to go and use the run as utility. So let's go and do that. So here I've brought up a command shell, and I'm going to use this run as utility here. And I want to use it to start the SQL Server Management Studio, and this is the name of the exe for it, SSMS.exe. And in run as, you specify the user's credentials you want to use with this /user : switch. So this says, I want to run as SSMS. I want to run as Minidan, this program here, and then this is the full path down to SQL Server Management Studio. So this will start up SQL Server Management Studio with Minidan's credentials. So let's go and give that a try. So we'll go and just run this, and it's going to ask me for Minidan's password because, of course, I have to be authenticated. So he was nice enough to give me his password this morning, so I've got it. And now it's going to start up SQL Server Management Studio. And when it does, it wants me to connect to a server, and notice the identity. The identity here is Minidan. And again, we're going to connect to the database engine like this. And now it's gone and started up the object browser for us. And notice it's connected to our database. And if I take a look at the database, I can see all of these databases. If I look at the server, I can see all these databases on the server. And if I open up CTE ranking and partitioning, I can even drill down and see all these tables. Here's the DBO employees table. And if I get the context menu, if I want, I can actually look at what's inside that table. And again, that's because on this particular database, Minidan is a DB data reader. He's in that role. However, let me get this out of the way. Let me try the other thing, which was one of the things I mentioned is handy for debug. I want to edit one of the top 200 rows. I'm going to put Sherman Oliver back on the second shift. And now when I go and change the focus, SQL Server Management Studio is going to try and write that back to the database. And when I do, I'm going to get an error here. It says no row was updated, some kind of error. Well, the error was Minidan does not have any write privileges on this database, so he was prevented from doing that. Let me clean this out, get rid of this. And if we go to one of the other databases, we're going to get an error saying you can't look at that. You do not have rights for anything on that database. And likewise, were I to go down here to the security menu and say, gee, I'd like to add a new login, it'll bring up a login dialog. But if I try and use it, I'm going to go and get an error. And if I look at the logins on this server, notice the only logins I see. I see SA, which is disabled, and Minidan, because I can only see the stuff I have rights to. So this is a good thing. If an ordinary user goes and uses SQL Server Management Studio to use the object browser, they'll certainly be able to browse the objects they have rights to. And say, for example, you gave a user their own database and made him the owner of the database. They could even make changes in that database, but they won't be able to touch anything else on the server. Okay, so that shows us that in fact regular users can also use the object browser, but they can only use it for the things they would normally have rights to. And get this guy out of the way. Okay, so now we're back to me running the object browser. So we've looked at the basics of the object browser in SQL Server Management Studio. You use it to browse the object model of a particular service you're interested in, and under the cover, SQL Server Management Studio uses SMO to implement that object model, and it allows you to drill through all the objects that are in that particular server. All of these folder or folder-like icons all have properties associated with them you can access with a right mouse click on the context menu, and many of them also allow you to go and create and delete, create and drop various objects too. And we can also see all the security information, all the logging information, a very nice way to be able to go and easily